So thank you very much, Gary, for that introduction. I'm afraid I've gone and done the rather academic thing of proposing a title and then writing a slightly different paper. So the title may give the impression that I'm going to be talking about the chain of evacuation rather more than I am tonight. What I've ended up doing, the chain of evacuation, is very much the subject of the book that Gary mentioned, which A, will be out in December, and B, because it's Wellcome Trust funded, will be available open access for anybody who wants to read it as a PDF or on an electronic device. There will also be a hard copy, but you'll have to pay for that. But as part of writing that book, I realized I needed to get a much broader sense of the operational history of the RAMC, for want of a better way of thinking about it. And I wrote a chapter which tried to deal with that, which then didn't fit with the book. And tonight's talk is an adaptation of that chapter. So I'm very pleased to have the opportunity to give it an outing, even though it's probably not going to be published at any point. So, in his official history of the medical services during the First World War, W.G. Macpherson argued that, quote, the changes which were effected in the period between the South African War and the war in Europe in administration, field organization, personnel, and power of expansion, in professional education and staff training, placed the medical and sanitary services in an infinitely better state of preparation than they had ever been in any previous period. And to this fact must be attributed in a large measure the exceptional freedom from adverse criticism with which they stood the test of war, end quote. Certainly, on the eve of the First World War, the RAMC was presented in official propaganda as an efficient, effective arm of a modern force prepared for war. Yet this image was remarkably fragile. Not only did the Corps on the eve of the war occupy an ambiguous space in relation to the rest of the armed services, as Ian Whitehead has shown in relation to the recruitment of officers, in the 4.5 years of war which followed the 4th of August 1914, the Corps, like the rest of the British military, would face profound challenges to its organizational rationale in the form of global industrialized warfare, forcing a variety of changes in unit practice. These changes encompass not only the medical, a subject that has been the source of a number of excellent specialist studies, but also the strategic and logistic. All implicated the work of the men who served in the Corps' ranks. Through examining the RAMC's deployment and service chronologically across the conflict, I want this evening to argue that the war marked a key moment in the cementing of the identity of the Corps as an integral element of the British military effort in a way that it had been unable to achieve previously, and certainly since its formal establishment in 1898. To give a very brief overview of the situation in which the Corps found itself on the eve of the First World War then. Since the Crimean War, the Army Medical Services had gone through a variety of reorganizations designed to improve the provision of medical care and raise the status of military medicine in the eyes both of the military establishment and British civil society. These efforts culminated in the establishment of the Royal Army Medical Corps in 1898 as a medical and sanitary unit which integrated both doctors, who formed the officer corps, and auxiliary medical staff who made up the ranks. Previously to this, they had been separate units, which is very confusing for the historian. This removed the provision of medical care from the direct control of the regiments, with medical officers now attached, along with one orderly servant, although regimental stretcher bearers were still drawn from the regimental ranks, and these were distinct from the RAMC stretcher bearers who were attached to field ambulances. While the new Corps gave medical attendants a more formal and integrated military identity than before, their status remained compromised by both their formerly non-combatant status under the terms of the Geneva Conventions and by their association with the female military nursing service organized in the first instance by Florence Nightingale from 1861. In 1900, Sir Garnet Wolseley, for one, still publicly referred to the RAMC not as soldiers, but as civilian attendants on the military. This lack of military status was further compounded by the disasters of the Boer War. the unit's dependence on the support, both in terms of resources and of manpower, on the nascent humanitarian aid movement, and the failures of hygiene which led to the rapid spread of illness, threatened the reputation of the new corps almost before it had established itself. In the wake of that conflict, the medical services were the subject of their own official inquiry, which led to a number of reforms as part of the wider Haldane reforms. Most significantly, these included a more formal relationship with medical aid organisations, principally the British Red Cross Society and the St John's Ambulance Association, both of which provided official training to the new reserve force, the RAMCT. This force, as with the territorial forces more broadly, was designed to increase the part-trained reserves on which the military could draw in the event of a major European conflict. The training regime at Aldershot for the regular RAMC was also revised, with the training of medical orderlies increasingly professionalised in line with and under the supervision of the military nursing service, now known as the Queen Alexandra's Imperial Nursing Service. It was these reforms which led to Macpherson's claim for eve of conflict preparedness. The increased importance of a civilly trained military medical reserve can be seen in the plans for medical provision in the event of a European war, drawn up by Sir Henry Wilson, then Director of Military Operations, in 1911. These plans, which have been described by Mark Harrison as rather vague, involved the evacuation of all casualties to stationary hospitals, from where they would be evacuated back to England. With the expanded reserves running the military hospitals in Britain, as proposed in the Haldane reforms, the regular medical services would then be free to move forward as needed, rather than getting stuck at base caring for the sick and injured. However, as Harrison has pointed out in his seminal volume, The Medical War, when war broke out in 1914, there proved to be a serious disconnect between pre-war plans and preparations and the lived reality on the ground. On the one hand, quote, the actual number of personnel on the active list was substantially lower than the medical plans suggested, and the War Office had to rely on civilian nurses and doctors to fill the gap, end quote, much as had been the case in 1899 in South Africa. On the other hand, plans for speedy and comprehensive evacuation broke down within days of the British Expeditionary Force departing overseas. Initially, mobilization went smoothly. Macpherson argued that, quote, the details of mobilization worked out on the whole smoothly and well, although one or two practical points, such as the arrival of riding and draft horses at the place of assembly of a medical unit in advance of their picketing gear, or of their drivers and attendants, caused some temporary embarrassments in a few cases. The late arrival of non-commissioned officers also occasionally created difficulties, but these were difficulties which only stimulated the initiative of commanding officers and were readily overcome. In total, 5 cavalry field ambulances, 20 divisional field ambulances, 6 clearing, 12 stationary, and 12 general hospitals, 1 convalescent depot, 6 ambulance trains, 3 hospital ships, 3 advanced and 3 base supply depots, 2 sanitary sections, and 11 sanitary squads were successfully mobilized, along with the RAMC officers and ranks nominally attached for water duties, who mobilized as attached to regimental units at the rate of 1 officer and 5 men per infantry battalion, 1 officer and 3 men per field artillery brigade, divisional train and divisional ammunition column, 1 officer and 2 men per cavalry regiment and brigade of horse artillery, and an appropriate number of men to smaller units. It was once deployed that the vagueness of Wilson's plans became clear. In comparison to the French and German equivalent medical services, the RAMC under Wilson's plans fielded comparatively few mobile units, while the Channel ports were generously provided with hospitals. The result was that, as Harrison notes, in the first engagements of the war, the medical services were supplied with ample space in which to treat casualties, but lacked the transport by which those casualties could reach them. This not only imperiled the wounded's chance of survival, but also placed a severe strain on frontline medical staff, who found themselves forced to treat men in the front line much more than was intended, rather than simply evacuating them. into the transport breach rushed providers of philanthropic aid in the form of medical units and motor ambulances, often adapted rapidly from private vehicles. Such private assistance ranged from the professional and well-organized to the extremely amateur. By the end of August 1914, the British Red Cross Society had sent a medical unit under Sir James Wright to Brussels, a small station party to Boulogne, and was organizing a party of 10 surgeons, 10 dressers, and 20 nurses to be sent to France under the authority of Sir Alfred Keogh, then the Society's chief commissioner. The Scottish Women's Hospital, under the formidable leadership of Dr. Elsie Inglis, had already been turned down by the War Office, famously with the injunction, "Go home, my good woman, and sit still," and instead had offered their services to the Belgian, French, and Serbian militaries, which gratefully accepted. The Scottish Women's Hospital was one of only a number of women's medical units who offered themselves for service under various military authorities. The British military refused all of them, but they were accepted with open arms, particularly by the French and Belgians. Less efficient, a group of young Quaker men, inspired by the reports of journalist Geoffrey Winthrop Young, began organizing the Anglo-Belgian Ambulance Unit, which would eventually develop into the Friends Ambulance Unit. While Richard Trench Gascoigne, owner of Lotherton Hall in Leeds, apparently adapted his private motor car as an ambulance and sent it out to France, complete with his personal chauffeur as driver. There's no record as to whether the chauffeur was, in fact, a willing volunteer. The results were chaotic. As Macpherson would later note, quote, "The lack of coordinated effort on the part of voluntary organizations led to confusion and embarrassment. And much of the time of the administrative medical services and others responsible at the War Office was occupied at the most critical period of the war in endeavoring to satisfy the conflicting interests of the various voluntary bodies, which the state of war had roused into activity. On one side, the British Red Cross found it difficult to carry out its duties under the field service regulations without War Office guidance, and on the other hand, the War Office, without association with voluntary organizations, had not full or adequate knowledge of what they were organizing or capable of carrying out." End quote. The fault was not wholly on one side. Winthrop Young recalled the Friends Ambulance Unit being treated with suspicion by military officials. It was a feature of the war, he wrote, and of the transition from the old small professional army to modern universal warfare, that when once battles began, all medical provision or supply of ambulances was found hopelessly inadequate for countless wounded. Our volunteer help was then accepted and claimed and even clamored for, so long as battle continued. But no sooner had the fighting died down than our emergency presence became an offense. It reflected upon the foresight of the senior officers responsible for the regular provision, who seeped up the front again when the bombardments relaxed. We were then abruptly disclaimed, and an attempt made to shuffle us back out of sight. Perspective matters in the recording of these histories. As a result, Sir Arthur Sloggett, a career medical officer who, as Director General of the Army Medical Services, was responsible for overseeing Wilson's plans, traveled to France in early October, where under the new title of Director General of Medical Services to the BEF, his role was to oversee the integration of military and voluntary units. His place as Director General Army Medical Services was taken by Sir Alfred Keogh, who, from his base at the War Office, took a strategic overview of the medical services as a whole. While the reallocation of Sloggett and Keogh's roles was vital in coordinating the military and voluntary provision of care, it did not immediately address the problems of the imbalance in the chain of evacuation as set out in Wilson's plan. In particular, the supply of ambulance wagons, these are the horse-drawn wagons as opposed to the ambulance cars, which are the motor vehicles, appears to have broken down entirely at Mons, where, quote, "only a limited number of ambulance wagons were available to the Second Corps. If all its field ambulances had been present, there would have been 60 ambulance wagons. As it was, there were only 20, and although the First Corps had its full complement, there appears to have been no coordinated coordinated effort to assist the Second Corps with field ambulances from the 1st and 2nd Divisions or from the cavalry. The publicization of these failures in the British press and similar ones at the Marne threatened to undermine public confidence in the Army medical services entirely in 1914. However, the stabilization of the front following the Battle of the Aisne enabled the RAMC to establish a system of main and advanced dressing stations. And this is a diagram of the system of evacuation that gets set up and runs roughly in this order for the rest of the war. As well as enabling the bringing of the deployed corps up to full strength, this enabled the introduction of more systematic collection and evacuation of the wounded, including the use of motor lorries, although this had the tendency to transfer the congestion to railheads in these years. The first motor ambulance convoys, made up of 50 motor ambulances, 3 lorries, 2 motor cars, and a motorcycle, and staffed jointly by the RAMC and the Army Service Corps in October, meant that all divisions were able to clear their wounded directly to either clearing hospitals, that's what the casualty clearing stations on that diagram were still known as, or ambulance trains. By November, 250 motor ambulances were available, and the BEF's infrastructure had, according to Harrison, improved beyond measure. By the end of 1914, therefore, the RAMC found itself in a position where many of its weaknesses had been exposed. Some of these, such as the relationship between military and medical services and voluntary organizations, and the resilience of the line of evacuation, were starting to stabilize. The reorganization of senior staff enabled a more coherent and comprehensive understanding of medical deployment on the Western Front. The development of the front line into the relatively static trench system provided the Corps time to regroup and reorganize a more efficient evacuation system, supplemented by the technology of increasing amounts of motorized transport, and also train transport as well in this period. If 1914 highlighted the weakness of RAMC organization on the Western Front, 1915 was to prove only limited evidence of amelioration of such deficiencies. Small steps were made in terms of tactical reorganizations and technical innovations, most notably the introduction of key medical techniques relating to wound drainage and the care for those with psychological injury. A number of key battles would, however, highlight serious problems of authority and communication between military and medical staff, which were not effectively addressed. These problems can be seen at both Neuve-Chapelle and Second Ypres. While the former was the major operation in which plans for medical provision were actually made in advance, including plans for triage and road clearance, failures in communication during the battle meant that these plans rapidly broke down. As a result, bottlenecks were created, exacerbated by failures to return stretchers to bearer companies as wounded remained on them while awaiting ambulance transport. Lack of telephones hampered communications about the numbers of patients a unit could expect to receive, and ambulance trains were inadequately equipped and staffed. This latter problem would persist throughout the year, reappearing during the Battle of Loos in September, where, according to Harrison, quote, the failure to coordinate admissions to the now renamed casualty clearing stations led to severe congestions in some units, while others lay idle, end quote. At Second Ypres, lack of communication led not to bottlenecks, but overstretch along the chain of evacuation. The whole of the medical arrangements were completely disorganized just before the gas attack of the 22nd of April. Ypres, for some days previously, had been heavily shelled and had become so dangerous that all units were ordered out of it by the GOC of the 5th Corps on the 20th and 21st of April. Consequently, when the gas attack was launched on the afternoon of the 22nd April, there were practically no main dressing stations thoroughly established in the 5th Corps, except that of No. 3 Canadian Field Ambulance at Vlamertinghe. Again, the pre-arranged plans for medical provision failed to first accord and then adapt to conditions on the ground. While dressing stations were reconstituted at Vlamertinghe and Saint-Jean, These new positions increased the distance needed to travel to clearing hospitals behind the lines, a fact that appears not to have been clearly communicated to the various medical establishments concerned. And the ultimate result is massive overstretch for the stretcher companies, who are required then to undertake manual carries over much longer distances than had been prepared for. Such failures of communication were not, however, confined to the Western Front. And I'm aware that I'm saying this in front of Gary, who's been doing research into this more recently than I have. The failures of the medical services at Gallipoli are historically notorious, not least because of the complete failure of military leaders to include medical officers in the development of battle plans. Just as poorly communicated changes in military objectives created problems at Neuve-Chapelle and Ypres, failures to achieve objectives had similar effects at Gallipoli. As Alexia Moncrief has argued, quote, the plans that had been made required significant medical infrastructure on the peninsula, and casualties were supposed to be sorted before being loaded onto ships for evacuation to the base. This would have meant that soldiers with minor injuries who had been ready to return to service within 3 or 4 days would not leave the area. Due to the failure to advance inland, the full complement of medical services was unable to land on the peninsula, and the medical arrangements then had to be improvised. End quote. This situation was compounded by the fact that responsibility for casualties and hospital ships was divided between the Army and Navy, requiring significant coordination, which often broke down, and there's stories of men being left on stretchers on the quay with the Army medical services refusing to take them further and the naval services refusing to pick them up because it was unclear where the line of demarcation lay. And these failures would be highlighted later in the report of the Dardanelles Commission. While the experiences of the wounded at Gallipoli would be further influenced by specific sanitation problems and poor execution of evacuation plans where they did exist, the conflict over who had authority and responsibility for the evacuation system was fundamentally similar, if more intense, to the failures in communication between different branches of the military service to that which occurred at the same time on the Western Front. The key failures of 1915, therefore, can be classified as twofold. On the one hand, military command, far from accepting the centrality of the RAMC in the effective evacuation of the battlefield and the consequent need for well-planned, well-integrated medical operations to facilitate this, continued to treat the Corps with considerable disdain, often excluding its officers from planning processes in ways which undermine the Corps' ability to organize effectively. On the other hand, the Corps itself appears to have had little capacity for adaptability or resilience in the face of unexpected alterations to plans. Adaptations were occurring on the ground, including the adoption of shift patterns for bearer companies, which were put into practice at Loos, the development of trenches to accommodate wheeled stretchers, and the introduction of designated bags to hold casualties' valuables during evacuation. And that relates to the name Rob All My Comrades. One of the reasons that that is a logical name for the RAMC is oftentimes the last casualty would see of his personal effects was when number 4 in a stretcher company would collect them all to carry back to a dressing station or an ambulance car, and they then get lost in transport. So whether or not the RAMC stretcher bearer had actually stolen them, the perception was that they were taking personal items from the wounded. They almost certainly weren't, but in the chaos of war, a great deal of personal effects did get lost. Hence the bags, which were intended to make this more difficult. Most significant, according to Harrison, was the development by the First Army, in the wake of Loos, of the pairing system of casualty clearing stations to provide more effective forward treatment and ease congestion along the line of evacuation. Under this system, patients were collected at casualty clearing stations until there were enough to fill an ambulance train. And casualty clearing stations are always positioned at a railhead for exactly this reason. As one casualty clearing station became full, the second one in the pair opened, with the first unit only reopening once fully cleared. This system, which was taken up by both the Third and Fourth Armies in 1916, not only made the process of evacuation swifter and more economically efficient, it also enabled increased disciplinary control over the wounded by the RAMC as they were collected in a single place for evacuation, rather than being allowed to wander, in the words of Surgeon General W.W. Pike, around giving inexperienced persons the idea that the medical arrangements were hopelessly broken down. In spite of this significant development, however, strategic planning for efficient medical evacuation had not, by the end of 1915, fully emerged. This would, as already been suggested, change in the early months of 1916 in the preparations made for the Battle of the Somme. The Somme has been identified by many medical historians, and most recently by Harrison, as the turning point in the organization of the RAMC into an effective, integrated modern military medical unit. According to Harrison, quote, from the start of the Somme offensive through to the end of operations at Passchendaele in November 1917, medical and other branches of the army had worked in harmony to refine the system of casualty disposal established in the wake of Loos, end quote. Certainly, the process of evacuation along the Western Front was significantly rationalized through the standardization of practice, which meant that the general situation as regards divisional medical services became common to all. This reflected a greater willingness on the part of High Command to integrate medical planning into wider strategy. As an example, the casualty evacuation plans for the Fourth Army were developed in detail by the Surgeon General and his staff in conjunction with Sir Henry Rawlinson, resulting in the provision of a large number of ambulance trains for medical evacuation at the Commander-in-Chief's insistence. In spite of this increased coordination and consequent greater integration between High Command and their medical services in terms of planning, as well as the adoption of the new CCS beyond the Fourth Army during the battle itself, the RAMC continued to struggle in the early days of the Somme offensive, principally due to Rawlinson's significant underestimation of casualty numbers. Stretcher bearers, both regimental and field ambulance, struggled to clear the battlefield in face of the heavy rate of fire. This not only made the act of collecting the wounded unsafe, it also destroyed the landscape through which wheeled stretchers and light rail were originally intended to run as a supplement to motor ambulances. This is the Canadian Bearer Corps, but it does give you some idea of some of the difficulties that they potentially had. Bearers found themselves faced with increasingly long and difficult carries, as the ground they had to cover was continuously disturbed, and importantly, the landmarks that they used for sighting were regularly destroyed. Transport difficulties on the rail lines further down the chain of evacuation meant that casualty clearing stations were forced to treat and stabilize far more serious cases than had been anticipated. That problem in 1914 of frontline medical services having to treat cases because of bottlenecks further back had shifted back to the casualty clearing stations but remained in place. However, unlike in earlier battles, the RAMC demonstrated increased resilience to unexpected challenges on the Somme, with evacuation procedures stabilizing into an effective, if for the RAMC, relentless rhythm within a few days. According to Harrison, over the course of the 5 months of the offensive, the principles of casualty disposal developed following Loos were put into place and followed more or less effectively. I would argue, however, that this resilience arose at least as much from the flexibility of units on the ground as on the implementation of standardized procedures. The expansion of the system of drafting of non-RAMC personnel to act as bearers and loaders, so that men of the pioneer battalions, as well as the lightly wounded retained at casualty clearing stations, were employed in this role, was one way in which the medical units were able to work with other military units rather than simply alongside them, as had previously been the case. At all levels, the RAMC was, by the end of 1916, adapting its practices on the Western Front to make itself a more effective arm, specifically of the military. If the Somme was a key moment for medical services on the Western Front, equally important developments were occurring in Egypt, when several hospital units arrived to create what Aaron Dolev has described as, quote, a real medical, surgical, and hospitalization system in eastern Egypt and the Canal Zone, end quote. The command structure in the East was rationalized in the wake of the Dardanelles campaign, with a single director of medical services being given responsibility for both health and medical services, reflecting the significance of hygiene to manpower efficiency in this theater. Also reflecting the specificities of the region, evacuation systems were developed which reflected the particular requirements of evacuating the wounded across the desert, often by what was regarded as the most uncomfortable forms of medical transport, the camel cassoulet. This focus on evacuation, as opposed to the stabilization of wounds close to the front line, which was occupying the RAMC on the Western Front, reflected the more mobile warfare of Sinai and Palestine. Just as in Western Europe, however, not all the lessons of 1915 had been learned. The fall of Kut in April was attributed in part to medical failure, reflecting the fact that, as at Gallipoli, the medical aspect of the campaign had been ignored and health issues had not been part of the planning and of the appraisement of the situation. Things did improve towards the end of the year as the focus on improving transport began to pay off. At Rafat, for example, 10 pairs of litters, 15 pairs of camel cassoulets, 12 sand carts, 12 cycle stretchers, and 6 sand sledges were available to each field ambulance, making it possible to evacuate 92 casualties at the time. I have absolutely no idea how a bicycle ambulance would function in the desert, but apparently it was supplied, or 12 of them rather were supplied. The campaigns of 1916, therefore, can be said to have offered a response, if not necessarily a solution, to the failures encountered in 1914 and 1915. The importance of integrating medical evacuations into operational planning was a lesson that was starting to be learned. The ability of units on the ground to demonstrate resilience through adaptability, not least because of an increasing supply of transportation and resources, was also beginning to emerge. Medical systems and technologies, such as the twinning of casualty clearing stations and the Carroll-Dakin system of wound drainage, had been introduced, although their use was not as widespread as some historians have claimed at this stage, and therefore were not as effective, as these historians have argued. It would be in the following year that these nascent advances would come more fully to fruition, forming, it might be argued, a medical parallel to the military learning curve, which saw the BEF developing on the lessons of the Somme to create an assault technique that contributed to an ultimate Allied victory, as has been argued by those present in this room. The RAMC would similarly build on the experiences of 1916 to develop systems able to cope with the highly attritional nature of warfare, which increasingly emphasized the treatment of casualties close to the front line as much as the prompt and efficient clearance of the battlefield. Central to this was the increased use of the twin casualty clearing station system, which allowed more specialist treatment to be carried out only a few miles behind the line. CCSs are usually about 6 miles behind the line along much of the front, rather than requiring evacuation to base hospital. The resulting success rates of such surgery were, according to Harrison, particularly in 1917 and 1918, impressive, and reductions in post-operative mortality were due in part to the improvement in techniques that followed the concentration of resources and the establishment of dedicated teams. But, he continues, it is almost impossible to separate the effects of specialization from more general improvements in the control of surgical infection and in the management of conditions known as surgical shock. Those developments can be attributed to a number of factors, including the introduction of blood transfusions and the increase of experience of transportation by units such as stretcher bearer units in keeping patients warm and reducing blood loss. There is also, as Julie Anderson has demonstrated, a role for the effective planning of logistics around the supply of blankets, so that clean, dry blankets are regularly circulated up to the front line for the use by stretcher bearers. Other improvements in treatment include including the treatment of non-surgical conditions such as psychological trauma, where, again, proximate treatment had a significant impact. After a spike in the number of diagnoses of the condition during the summer of 1916, policy shifted towards a greater reliance on the judgment of regimental medical officers as to the necessity for evacuating such casualties. Although a conversation that Gary and I were having just before this lecture is making me rethink that argument slightly. I'll have to come back to you on that one. While on the one hand, this led many regimental medical officers to gaining a reputation for callous lack of regard for the mental health of the men they cared for, as described by Max Plowman in this rather lengthy excerpt from his 1927 novel. The resulting increase in men being kept with their units or treated no further back than the casualty clearing stations or rest stations was probably ultimately beneficial to their long-term chances of recovery, as it prevented men from feeling isolated and defined entirely by their condition. Similarly, increased understanding of and specialism around common conditions such as heart disease helped to increase the swift differentiation of those soldiers who could be sent back to the front from those who should be quickly discharged, something which saved lives as well as improving military efficiency. As with systems of wound drainage, including the highly influential Carroll-Dakin treatment already mentioned, which became the established system of treatment at casualty clearing stations in 1917, the research on heart disease was initiated earlier in the war, but only disseminated later to the extent that it changed practice on the ground. So you can see in medical journals initial publications in 1915, 1916, but it doesn't actually affect practice within the RAMC until 1917. As a result, the Commission on Medical Establishments could report in 1917 that, quote, the amount of operative surgery that is being done at the front is steadily increasing, while that on the lines of communication is diminishing in proportion, end quote. The report went on to note, however, that, quote, on the lines of communication, they seem to know but little of the medical arrangements at the front, and it is the same at the front with regards to the line of communication. Communications between the two still weren't ideal. While the RAMC showed itself by and large to be adaptable to the changing nature of warfare as military strategy developed, not all innovations were successful. The attempt of the 25th Division to use battalion and regimental stretcher bearers as part of a leapfrogging system of manual evacuations north of the Neuve-Église-Messines road in place of field ambulance bearer companies led to the erratic distribution of the wounded, something which had a knock-on effect on the allocation of stretchers, leading to shortages in the front line, severe enough to be discussed in some detail by the official history. In general, however, field ambulances had significantly improved their resilience to such setbacks, so that by the time the Battle of Passchendaele had descended into its notorious sea of mud, requiring 6 trained bearers to a stretcher to effect evacuation, quote, the general organization actually led to so rapid an evacuation that in 1 or 2 instances, the casualty clearing stations were overwhelmed, and the work in keeping them clear by means of ambulance trains was much delayed. We're still getting bottlenecks. Just a note on this picture, you'll see there are 7 men to this stretcher. I have a feeling that these are regimental or co-opted bearers, although there are clearly some at least one. You can see the small patch on the arm of the man in the middle. Some medical corps stretcher bearers who would have had more stretcher drill than regimental stretcher bearers would. As at the Somme, servicemen from other units were used to supplement trained RAMC bearers. In addition, improved arrangements for collecting the wounded into shelter, where they were provided with food and blankets until further evacuation could be arranged, ensured a smoother process overall and one that resulted in fewer complaints from the wounded. However, it was not the incremental improvements on the Western Front that provided the best evidence of RAMC development in 1917, but rather, as both Harrison and Dolev have argued, the Palestine campaign of 1917 to 18, which was by far the most impressive from a medical point of view. The successes which were achieved there in preventative medicine and casualty evacuation have been justly attributed to the commander of the Egyptian Expeditionary Force, General Edmund Allenby, who arrived in Palestine with the expectation that medicine would be firmly integrated into operational planning. His successes, particularly in relation to hygiene, according to Harrison, derived from the combination of providing the necessary resources to improve the force's health and the appointment of prominent civilian medical professionals, such as Robert Luce, who served as Allenby's Director of Medical Services. Harrison goes on to suggest that Allenby learnt lessons from the Western Front, although I would argue that it perhaps took longer for the lessons to percolate down to action on the ground in that theatre than Harrison acknowledges. Certainly in both theatres, 1917 was the year when the key lessons derived from the crises of 1914 and 15 began to change practice on the ground in demonstrable ways, in parallel with and partially in response to the developments in military tactics which were occurring at the time. However, the ability of the RAMC to respond effectively to strategic challenges in Europe would face one of its severest tests in early 1918 with the launch of the German Spring Offensive. As with many of the teeth units, that is the combatant units of the British Army at this time, the RAMC was suffering from a serious manpower shortage, not helped by the fact that the fitting out of the British force in Italy diverted some of the medical units and personnel of the RAMC from work on the Western Front at a time when personnel were becoming more and more difficult to obtain. Planning for operations also echo Gary Sheffield's characterization of the BEF at this point as being unprepared for defensive fighting in a war of motion rather than attrition. In the case of medical arrangements, this meant that casualty clearing stations were sited in dangerously forward positions and were required to move as entire units, necessitating extensive logistical planning and resources of up to 100 lorries or a complete ambulance train, rather than being divided into more mobile modules, such as would require only 8 or 9 lorries and would be capable of being got ready for work immediately in a new site. In addition, in the case of the Fifth Army, there were no plans as to where the units could retire at the time that the offensive began. The Fifth Army appears to be more than usually disorganized in this regard. While leadership at the Army level may have left medical services exposed when the offensive came, the work at corps and divisional level again provides evidence of the increased resilience of medical units on the ground. Quote, the medical services of the corps and divisions of the Fifth Army worked smoothly and well, and the retirement of regimental aid posts, advance and main dressing stations, which successively fell back on one another, appears to have presented no difficulty, end quote. As a result, whatever the deficiencies in medical strategy, there stands out one great fact, that owing to the energy and initiative of all ranks, no patient admitted to a casualty clearing station of the Fifth Army was abandoned, and all, except those who died before evacuation, were got away. While this pattern was not necessarily reproduced across the forces engaged by the Spring Offensive, with casualties among medical service personnel both killed and captured adding to the manpower shortages already noted, quote, The experiences of the 10 days of the German offensive against the 5th and 3rd Armies had shown how important it was for medical units to retain their mobility and be guided by the principles laid down in the manual of RAMC training. Just a short note on the manual of RAMC training, that was originally published in 1911 and hadn't been revised. So in 1918, there was still recourse to these very early pre-war plans. This need for mobility will be reinforced in the late summer and autumn of 1918 during the 100 Days campaign, which preceded the armistice. Just as the immobility of the casualty clearing stations had affected the retreat, so too in the advance. The Fourth Army had greater difficulty in evacuating the wounded in August than it had during the large set-piece battles of earlier years, when casualties were in fact higher, due to the fact that, quote, the advance into the enemy's lines was to a depth of some 9 or 10 miles, and casualty clearing stations had not yet been fully opened in more forward areas, end quote. The Second Army similarly made rapid advances through Belgium in October through large areas of devastated landscape across which evacuations had to be organized, while the Third Army left many of its casualty clearing stations behind during its rapid advance in early November. In fact, in an echo of the challenges faced by the RAMC in the earliest days of the war, quote, the special medical problems of all 5 armies were undoubtedly those of transport. The numbers of casualty clearing stations was adequate in all armies, but they were, from the very commencement, much further back than in previous battles. This handicap was accentuated, too, by the rapidity of the advance. Motor ambulance convoys and motor ambulance transport generally was also adequate in numbers. The number of convoys was indeed increased by the end of October by the arrival of numbers 47 and 48, but the damage to the roads and the general traffic prevented their working as rapidly and as uninterruptedly as might otherwise have been the case. The ambulance trains also ran with less regularity, owing to delays and damage to railway lines. The War of Movement in 1918 serves as an important reminder that, as significant as the development of the casualty clearing station system had been in the years of trench warfare, the mobility of the field ambulance as a unit continued to have a significant role in the planning and execution of a successful system of evacuation. The ability of these units to successfully evacuate the wounded falling back quickly in retreat or moving forward with the front line in advance, covering large areas of war-shattered territory, played an important role in both the BEF's avoidance of defeat in the spring and the securing of victory in the autumn. In particular, the early lessons of the necessity of providing sufficient transport for medical evacuations proved themselves to have been learned, although the difficulty of negotiating landscape maybe not so much. Sufficient motor convoys were in place, even if war-damaged infrastructure along the chain of evacuation posed additional challenges to the smooth running of the process. Here again, the systems developed over the course of the war showed themselves to be resilient. To conclude, an overview of RAMC operations over the course of the war supports the argument put forward by Harrison that the RAMC followed its own learning curve. The organization and functioning of the Corps at multiple levels improved over the 4.5 years of war in response to both the stresses and innovations encountered, with such developments appearing to happen with increased rapidity after 1916, as the lessons learned from earlier failures were increasingly incorporated on the ground. These lessons, along with technological and medical developments, enabled the Corps to develop a remarkable level of resilience and adaptability in face of unexpected challenges. At the heart of these developments was the steady improvement in communications between military and medical units, particularly in terms of operational planning. As Harrison notes in relation to the medical services on the Western Front, quote, the keys to success were coordination between different branches of the Army and flexibility, which in turn depended on good staff work and excellent communications, end quote. He suggests that across military theatres, the increased awareness on the part of military leaders of the importance of health and good medical care to military morale and effectiveness made them increasingly responsive to the needs of the RAMC. Yet, as the evidence of some of the failures of 1918 demonstrates, failures in communication continued to occur on a regular basis throughout the war, with military and medical priorities coming into conflict on numerous occasions. In such circumstances, the needs of the military always won out over those of the medical services, something symbolized by transport systems which throughout the war, whether on road or on rail, always prioritized convoys taking reinforcements and resources to the front over medical transports evacuating the wounded from the battlefield. Thus, while the RAMC arguably ended the war in a more secure position as a recognized and valued arm of the military services, ambiguities as to its status remained. As Ian Whitehead has argued in relation to the medical officers of the Corps, quote, despite the favorable record at the Western Front, the war revealed that the process of reform within the Army Medical Services had not yet reached its conclusion, end quote. The Corps itself might put a positive gloss on the war, as celebrated by the official history and recruitment posters, such as this one published in 1919. The battle for full recognition as a valid unit of the military service still needed to be fought, however. As late as 1947, and after another world war, the Hymn to the Fallen of the Royal Army Medical Corps felt the need to address social unease about the work of a unit that undertook military medical service unarmed and with the aim of saving rather than taking life. Through its rather defensive verse, unarmed, they bore an equal burden, shared each adventure undismayed. Not less they earned the victor's guerdon, not least were these in the crusade. Thank you.
You want to find the sergeant? I know where he is. He's drinking all the company rum. If you want to find the private, I know where he is. I know where he is. I know where he is. If you want to find the private, I know where he is. He's hanging on the old barbed wire.